Well, this is just unnecessarily ominous, isn't it? And honestly, if you think about it, there's a lot that's unnecessary about Starfox. Did they really need to achieve a fully playable 3D game on the Snes when it was designed purely for 2D sprite-based games? Well, of fucking course they did. But let's shift gears into what is quite easily one of the greatest pieces of music in the history of gaming. And no, it's not the Culinaria theme, so zip your pants back up. Whereas the previous track creates an overwhelming feel of dread and fear of the unknown, this track flips that notion on its head and says fuck it, maybe the glass is half full. Space, where there's limitless opportunity for discovery, great stories to be told, infinite possibility, new worlds to be explored, and most importantly an absolute banger of a Super Nintendo game to be played. So without any further ado, I give you Starfox. I came into this review fully prepared to face the realities of playing an early 3D game on a system that was designed purely for sprite-based gaming, not to mention the fact that we're now 25 years removed from its release date. The controls are going to be clunky, the frame rate's going to be utterly terrible, and the draw distance is going to be non-existent. But the reality is that in spite of these issues, not only does Starfox hold up some 25 years after its launch, it's still fucking brilliant. Nintendo has a well-deserved reputation for just playing the hits, with countless Mario and Zelda iterations over the years, but some of their other classic franchises tend to get the cold shoulder when it comes to receiving regular entries. But in the case of Starfox, you can kind of see why that is. Its track record for quality has been inconsistent and has likely tarnished the franchise's value, but those first two games, holy shit. Now, I could give you the backstory on the series' many ups and downs, but at this point that would just be beating a dead horse and stating the obvious, because it's pretty common knowledge. But in the interest of padding out my review, here it is. Some 77 years ago, a damn near complete Starfox 2 was thrown out in favour of Starfox 64. This was an attempt by Nintendo to prevent the little Snes title from stealing any of the thunder from the mighty N64. Now, the game would later see a release on Nintendo's Super Nintendo Mini, and for that everyone was in equal parts delighted and then massively disappointed when they actually got to play the thing. The GameCube era is perhaps the weirdest of all, as the Starfox naming characters were slapped onto Rare's long in development Ocarina of Time clone Dinosaur Planet, and that was renamed Starfox Adventures. Starfox fans had been clamouring for a proper follow-up to Starfox 64, and they were then treated to the Konami-developed Starfox Assault, which saw terrible on-foot missions as they were the style at the time, but adding those to the game only served to irritate the fanbase. The DS saw the release of a unique but kind of hollow entry called Starfox Command, which was inspired by some of the elements in Starfox 2. Honestly, it was quite enjoyable, but it didn't feature fully fleshed out levels like you'd expect. Instead, it was just a variety of 3D arenas which you could fly around with objectives to complete. Starfox Zero saw the long-awaited return of the franchise, and fans were absolutely delighted when they finally got a true sequel to Starfox 64. Just kidding, it's a fucking diabolical motion-controlled piece of shit that required the player to have two sets of eyes, one for focusing on the Wii U's gamepad and another to focus on the TV at the very same time. And that's not some kind of joke, it's an actual fucking thing. Finally, and in the interest of suiting my narrative rather than respecting the actual timeline, the 3DS gave us a proper Starfox game in Starfox 64 3DS. Yes, it's just a remake, but in the sea of shit that had become the standard for the franchise, this was a delightful treat and honestly a wonderful remake. As many of you already know, this game features an absolutely killer soundtrack that has stood the test of time. Whilst there's only a handful of tracks here, they are all absolute classics. The visuals, which were inconceivable for their time, still look good to this day, purely based off of the fact that they're formed of basic primitive 3D shapes. But the thing that really blows me away to this day is the cinematic presentation, which will often see the camera panning 3D environments during stage introductions and boss battles. One of the coolest examples of this is when the camera pans around your R-wing as you plummet to the ground just after you lose a life. It even goes as far as to rip off some of George Lucas's classic wipe transitions from Star Wars. Starfox's best qualities aren't purely aesthetic either. The controls are surprisingly responsive for its age. Being able to rotate your R-wing to avoid obstacles and performing the iconic barrel roll to deflect incoming enemy projectiles just never gets old and truly makes you feel like some sort of anthropomorphic Jedi master. Another cool feature is that the R-wing takes visible damage as its wings can actually be blown off. This is a fantastic visual, and one that really helps raise the stakes and make you realise that things have gotten pretty goddamn dire. What's even more interesting about this is that if you lose a wing, you're reduced to the default weapon, so you really want to watch where you're flying. Speaking of weapons, you begin with your default blaster and some screen-destroying Nova bombs. Throughout each of the levels, every time you collect a weapon power-up, your firepower is increased, as you might expect. The first power-up is the Twin Blaster that allows you to take down enemies faster and with greater ease. And then finally you get the Plasma Twin Blaster, which is absolutely awesome and tears enemies to shreds. You can also pick up shields, which cause your R-wing to render in this weird blinking wireframe fashion. Boss battles are pretty simplistic for sure, but literally blowing away parts of the game's multiple bosses is a level of area-specific destruction that you just didn't see in 1993, and it still makes for some really satisfying battles to this day. Simplistic 3D geometry aside, they are still a spectacle to behold, with large screen-spanning enemies spinning, rotating, and changing form to reveal their weak points to you. It's some cool shit. Scripted sequences throughout the levels see you help out your buddies, Slippy Toad, Pepper Hare, and some arsehole called Falco Lombardi, who rumour has it is actually a distant relation of popular 80s wrestling villain Steve Lombardi, better known as the Brooklyn Brawler. And he was a dirtbag too, so to me that connection kind of makes sense. What's neat about this is that during the missions you're actually treated to different dialogues of your team depending on your actions. So whether or not you helped them, or you accidentally or deliberately shot them, or just flat out got them killed, this is something which is fantastically punctuated during the end scene of each level, where all your teammates check in by flying in formation and then triumphantly launching off into the sky, which I maintain is just the coolest shit. What makes that so great is seeing in the formation when one of your pilots has been downed. It's a little detail, but it adds some emotional weight to your performance. Kind of like when you see a three-legged dog walking in the street. I mean, he's getting on just fine without it, but just knowing that he's missing a leg really bums you out. Same thing. It also reminds me a little of the Hill of Graves from Cannon Fodder, where you're reminded of all the heroes that your dumbass got killed. Some of the levels take place in a cockpit view, which is a neat change, but also the opportunity to wow you with its presentation, as there's a slick transition that occurs when switching between the internal and the external views. Now don't get me wrong, the frame rate absolutely plummets when you do this, but it's still bloody cool. The levels are split into 3 routes of varying difficulty, which represent easy, normal and hard. Each of the routes consists of different stages with the exception of the first and last levels, which are always the same. And if you're a completionist madman, there's even 2 hidden stages, the black hole and another dimension. Flying through twisting and spiraling rings to collect health, blasting enemies to bits, swooping down low to fly through geometry, turning your R-wing on its side to squeeze through the tiniest of gaps. Everything in Starfox was designed to make you feel like the biggest of badasses, and crucially, it all pays off. Some levels feature confined indoor environments that see you narrowly escaping collisions with often evolving and shifting surroundings. At some point it feels more like a puzzle game than a shooter, seeing you fire at switches to determine which way a platform will fall or lower. But if you're anything like me, you're going to lose a lot of health during these sequences because it's so hard to resist the urge to turbo boost past the obstacles like a badass, even if it does cost you a wing or 2. Wing damage and weapons are persistent throughout the levels, so your performance early on can really impact your chances of success in later levels. This kind of level progression is commonly associated with 2D shooters, but it's really nice to see it here too. And of course, like those games, if you die, you're going to lose everything. In spite of the performance issues, you really get the impression that the devs squeezed absolutely everything they could out of the Super Effects chip, and the result is a game that delivers a truly timeless pick up and play gaming experience. The sheer spectacle and cinematic presentation remain intact. Even if your tolerance for low frame rates ain't what it used to be, my advice on this one is simple. The odds are that you already own this game in one form or another, so if you haven't played it yet, you owe it to yourself to give it a shot. And even if you have played it before, it is always a great time to go back and recapture some of the magic that was the Super Nintendo.